Well, hello. So glad we have the opportunity to worship together, even if it is from a distance. I want to take just a few moments this morning to focus our minds on the communion, to focus our minds on partaking of the Lord's Supper in a worthy manner. We've had the opportunities over the past few weeks to look at many different parables, to look at many different stories of the marriage feast, to look at these different things that were taking place in the Lord's Supper that foreshadowed the Lord's Supper. One of the ones that I wanted to take a look at today was one of the parables of Jesus that seems very directly connected to this idea of the Messianic feast. And so if you turn over in Matthew, to Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is in the midst in this parable of telling a series of parables, kind of condemning the Pharisees, condemning these leaders of Israel that had rejected the Messiah, that were in the process of rejecting God entirely. And so he's bringing this up and using this example to further this illustration and really bring it home into chapter 23, where he's going to completely expose and condemn the entire idea of Phariseeism. In Matthew 22 and verse 1, it says, Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Again, he sent out other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guest, he saw a man there who had not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes? And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. We see a couple of really important points for us to understand here. In particular, the first is that there are many who the invitation to the feast, the invitation to fellowship with the Lord is offered, and many reject him. And in fact, this is not just a simple rejection. This is an entire refutation of the king. It's a flouting of his authority. And that's why these rebels feel comfortable mistreating and ultimately murdering the servants that had been sent to come out. We see just obvious parallels with how this has been the story of Israel, that Israel has just flouted the authority of God. They have murdered the prophets. They have rejected men like John the Baptist. They've rejected Jesus himself. And we know that ultimately they're going to kill the Messiah, just as they have killed the other prophets and even John the Baptist. And so we are unsurprised to hear that these rebels, their ultimate fate is the destruction of their city and everything is burned down. We know that's what happens in 70 AD. Jerusalem is indeed finally destroyed in that final apocalyptic scene. But there's also an important point to note that beyond those who were expected to respond who didn't, that then the slaves are sent out to go to the unexpected, to the rest of the world essentially, and to call all of those, and notice it says good and evil, and invite them to the feast. And so we are then transported into the feast scene, and we see that there are some who may have accepted the invitation, but were not prepared for the wedding. They weren't really prepared to celebrate and to honor the wedding feast, to honor the guests and to honor ultimately the bride and the groom of the wedding. And that's a grave insult, particularly in this culture that we're talking about here. And so when the king sees this man who is not prepared, who has not taken the time and not taken the appropriate measures to clothe himself, he's thrown out into the outer darkness. He's treated just the same as that rebel who was destroyed. And so we might be asking ourselves, well, what's the point of this parable? How does it relate? Well, what are we clothing ourselves in? How do we make ourselves ready for the feast? How do we prepare ourselves for the wedding feast of Christ, where the Christ and the bride, the church, will be united once more? Well, what we clothe ourselves in is our good deeds. We clothe ourselves in faith. We clothe ourselves in trust and righteousness in the Lord's goodness. And so if we are not prepared for those things, it doesn't matter whether we've accepted the invitation, whether we have theoretically shown up to the wedding feast. if we're not prepared to be clothed in the right way, clothed in the garments of Jesus Christ, to be taking off these old sinful garments to put on those new white wedding clothes of Christ, if we're not prepared for those things, then we're not going to be allowed to stay at the wedding feast. And so as we think of these things, as we connect them to the feast that we're about to partake of, this communion feast that is a foreshadowing of that greater heavenly feast to come, it should remind us that we need to make sure that we're not just showing up to the wedding. Are we prepared to celebrate like we're supposed to? Are we prepared to honor the king, to honor the bride and the groom by making sure that we're appropriately attired? And I'm not talking about, modesty. I'm talking about, are we appropriately attired in the good deeds that we're supposed to be doing? Are we appropriately attired in the robes and the clothes that Christ himself has prepared for us? Are we prepared to celebrate the wedding feast appropriately? Let's think about these things as we partake in the communion. Let's focus not just on the fact that we've been invited to the feast. Let's make sure we're appropriately celebrating the feast so that when we arrive and when the king is here, we can celebrate with him in true glory. Thank you so much.